Worship is more than music, more than words on a screen. It is the posture of our hearts before a holy God. The Bible says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. True worship is giving God the honor he deserves in our songs, our actions, and in the way we live. Romans 12:1 tells us to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is how we worship him. It's not just something we do. It's who we are. People created to glorify the one who gave us life.
Well, welcome to everyone who's joining us today as we continue our series on the Old Testament book of Zephaniah. It is the beginning of February here in northwestern Pennsylvania, and we are in a deep freeze, lots of cold, lots of snow. It is winter time, and we're glad that you're enjoying this talk, hopefully from the comfort of a warm home. Zephaniah is a great book for us to be studying, although admittedly when we began this series a couple weeks ago, I shared with you that I wasn't even sure that the book of Zephaniah existed in the Bible. But thanks to Brian Spence, our worship director, and his encouragement to us to preach on this book, we are looking at it intently for a number of weeks. And I've become very excited about our study of this short little Old Testament book for two reasons. First of all, as with all the books of the Bible, there is such an important message in them for us today. And sometimes we have to sort through some layers as we look at these books written so long ago to understand exactly how they apply to us today. But there is very much a message for us in all of them for our present moment of time, and Zephaniah is no exception to that. But the second reason I'm excited about us studying this book is it gives us an opportunity to talk about how we read the Bible in general, and how we apply the Bible in general in our present context. Specifically, how we read and apply the Old Testament, and even more specifically, how we read and apply the Old Testament prophets. Because if we don't do this thoughtfully, we're prone to come up with all kinds of misunderstandings about who God is and what the Bible actually teaches and how we ought to live in the present day. But when we bring a thoughtfulness and an intentionality to trying to understand what these ancient books communicate and how we are to apply them in our present moment, again, we see that there is a really powerful message for us in the present. And today, in the text we're going to look at out of Zephaniah, I think that becomes really clear. We're in chapter 2 of this short little book. Hopefully you've had a chance to read it, only 3 chapters long. And chapter 2 contains the bulk of a section that is pretty common in most of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. And it's labeled as an oracle against the nations, or a pronouncement of judgment on the nations surrounding ancient Israel. So what I want to do today is I want to read this text in its entirety. We'll make some comments along the way to help us understand this ancient passage. And then we're going to talk about how not to interpret it and how to correctly interpret it. We're going to see, again, an amazing message of hope for us in the present day. So, chapter 2, starting in verse 4, you're going to hear a lot of ancient geographical names in this passage that you're probably not familiar with. Don't worry so much about them, because we're going to draw a map in a minute and explain what they are. Again, beginning in verse 4 of chapter 2, the book of Zephaniah. For Gaza shall be deserted, and Ashkelon shall become a desolation. Ashdod's people shall be driven out at noon, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Ah, inhabitants of the seacoast, you nation of the Cherethites, the word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines, and I will destroy you until no inhabitant is left. And you, O seacoast, shall be pastures, meadows for shepherds, and folds for flocks. The seacoast shall become the possession of the remnant of the house of Judah, on which they shall pasture, and in the houses of Ashkelon they shall lie down at evening. For the Lord your God will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes. I have heard the taunts of Moab and the revelings of the Ammonites, how they have taunted my people and made boasts against their territory. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Moab shall become like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a land possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a waste forever. The remnant of my people shall plunder them, and the survivors of my nation shall possess them. This shall be their lot in return for their pride, because they scoffed and boasted against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be terrible against them. He will shrivel all the gods of the earth, and to him shall bow down, each in its place, all the coasts and islands of the nations. You also, O Ethiopians, shall be killed by my sword. And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste like the desert. Herds shall lie down in it, every wild animal, the desert owl and the screech owl shall lodge on its capitals. The owl shall hoot at the window, the raven croak on the threshold, for its cedar work will be laid bare. Is this the exultant city that lived secure, that said to itself, I am, and there is no one else? What a desolation it has become, a lair for wild animals. Everyone who passes by it hisses and shakes the fist. Not a very uplifting passage, particularly if you're an inhabitant of one of these ancient nations. Zephaniah says God is going to bring judgment against these nations that surround ancient Israel. And remember, as we've talked before, the geography of ancient Israel is really important for us to understand. We have the Mediterranean Sea here. This would be present-day Israel here. Jerusalem, the capital of ancient Israel, was roughly here. And surrounding ancient Jerusalem, or ancient Israel, were a lot of foreign powers that were not nice. Assyria to the north, Egypt to the south, the Moabites to the east, and over here on the coast, the Philistines. All enemies of Israel, all surrounding the ancient nation. In this passage we just read, again, using some geographic names from the ancient world, Zephaniah brings an indictment on all these foreign nations that surround Israel, that represent Israel's enemies. And he says, God is going to deal with you. And you caught the last part of the passage where he talks about Assyria, this country to the north, which is actually has its capital city of Nineveh over here to the east. Zephaniah says the city is going to be so wrecked by God that all that will live in it is animals. This is a passage of extreme judgment against these ancient enemies of Israel. Now, what do we do with a passage like this in the present day? How do we interpret it and how do we understand it? And I want to start by talking about how we do not interpret it or understand it. Number one, we do not apply this passage to present day nations. We do not apply this passage to present day nations, even though it is tempting to do so and sadly often done. Well-intentioned, well-meaning Christians will read ancient statements against nations in the ancient world, and they will suggest that somehow these statements directly apply to present-day national and political realities. They do not. When Zephaniah spoke these words, he didn't have in mind any present-day nation. And oftentimes when people read the Old Testament prophets, they're quick to associate the statements in the book to nations in the present day, be it the United States, be it the United States' enemies. It's easy to think that somehow this ancient statement applies directly in the present moment. It does not. These were statements against ancient nations that existed in the ancient Near East. They do not apply directly to present day realities. Now, if you want to read them and say, some of these statements against foreign nations seems a lot like what's happening today, well, if you want to make that association, fine. Just don't take the step of suggesting that these ancient statements apply directly to present realities. Second, this is probably even more important. These ancient texts do not give us a complete view of God. They do not give us a complete view of God. What they give us is insight into how this individual living in the 7th century BCE understood God and understood what God was doing in the world. That was almost 3,000 years ago that Zephaniah spoke or wrote these words. And as we said 2 weeks ago, our understanding of God, it grows and develops throughout the biblical record. It grows and develops throughout history. Zephaniah is writing 600 years before Jesus shows up and gives us a very clear and definitive explanation and presentation of who God is and what God is like. And what Jesus reveals about God is oftentimes very different from what people like the Old Testament prophets thought and understood about God. The understanding of God throughout the pages of the biblical record, it's growing, it's developing. And yet there's a great temptation to pull a passage like this out of the Old Testament and say, well, this is what God is like. If God has enemies, He destroys them. Well, is that what Jesus taught about God? Jesus seemed to teach something very different. Jesus called us in the name of God, not to destroy our enemies, but to love and forgive our enemies. Zephaniah is not giving us the full picture. Zephaniah is giving us insight into what people in the 6th or 7th century BCE thought God was like and thought about how God was acting in the world. So, if we don't do these two things, what we do is we look at the larger picture that is being presented. What is the larger picture that we pull from this text that does help us understand correctly something about how God works in the world and works in our lives? What is the bigger movement, the bigger flow that is affirmed and confirmed by Jesus 600 years after this passage is written, that helps us appreciate how this ancient message points us toward a present day truth? And I want to suggest that bigger picture is very clear once we understand more particularly the details. Follow me on this. What are you afraid of? Not afraid of to the extent that you can't leave your house or can't get out of bed in the morning. No. What is that underlying fear that is just sort of always present? You function fine, but it's always there under the surface, always nagging you, always present, always just the irritation under your emotional skin. Is it fear about your health? Or are you always worrying, this pain I feel in my side, could that be cancer? If you look at the news stories in our news feeds, we as a culture are overly consumed with fear about our health. Oh my goodness, if I ate the wrong thing, if I engaged in wrong practices, if I didn't follow this regimen, I'm going to shorten my life by 3.5 years. Do you have this underlying fear all the time about your health? Finances, another big one. Again, it doesn't stop you from getting out of bed in the morning, but you're just always, are we ever going to get out of debt? How are we going to ever pay for college for the kids? I don't think we have enough money for retirement. Man, I even wonder if we're going to make the next mortgage payment. Is it a situation at work? I'm so stressed about my boss, and we don't seem to communicate or relate correctly, and just always anxious about going. We're at school. I'm gonna see those kids. I don't have anyone to sit with in the lunchroom. This teacher just seems to have it out for me. Is it fear about a family member, my son or my daughter? I'm just so concerned for their well-being. If my experience is anything mirroring the rest of yours, and if the messaging of our culture is correct, we all seem to live with this underlying sense of fear about a lot of different issues. If you lived in 7th century Israel, Judah specifically, what would your underlying fear be? I can pretty much tell you it wouldn't have been cancer. You might have had fear about your health, but I'm guessing not so much, because people were just so accustomed to people getting sick and dying that it almost didn't become something you feared. It was just a reality of life. Yes, you might have been concerned about your finances, but probably not at the same level we feel that today. You wouldn't have been worried about your teacher because you wouldn't have been in school. You wouldn't have been worried about your boss because most likely you didn't have a job. You were just a subsistence farmer. I'll tell you one thing you would worry about, though, if you lived in 7th century Judah. You would worry if today when you woke up, the neighboring tribe was coming over the hill to attack you. You would worry about what the day would bring in terms of foreign military conquests, and particularly if you were in the ruling class of ancient Judah in the 7th century. And this is probably the group of people to whom Zephaniah addresses his words primarily. You would daily be fearful if some of these surrounding foreign powers were going to come and lay siege to your city and your land. And that would be a daily fear, unlike it is for most of us. I mean, yes, some of us might worry that some nation or country is going to take us over at some point. But most of us don't get up every morning and think, I wonder if this will be the day that we're conquered by a foreign territory. If you're in 7th century Judah, and particularly in the ruling class, you're wondering about that every day. And it's a source of great anxiety and fear, because here's why. Number one, you just don't know. There's no CIA, there's no satellite imagery. Intelligence in the ancient world isn't at the level it is today. You just don't know what's coming over the horizon. But what you do know is whatever it is, it's not good. Because when ancient powers conquer other territories, it's brutal and devastating. You can read enough about that in other passages of the Old Testament. There's no respect for the civilian population. It's destruction, devastation, great suffering. And that would have been a daily concern. What does Zephaniah say about that concern? Well, he really says three things. He says, number one, all those foreign powers that you're worried about, God will deal with them or it. God's going to deal with those foreign nations that you're worried about. And the second thing that Zephaniah doesn't so much say, but a lot of the other minor prophets in passages just like this one, they do say, God will use them or it. A number of passages in the Old Testament that have judgment oracles like this, they talk about the fact that God is not only going to deal with the threat, but God is actually going to use those foreign powers to accomplish His good purpose on behalf of the nation of Israel. And the third thing this passage reveals to these ancient Israelites is that God will do it in His time, the right time. There's no indication in when all this is going to happen, although interestingly, we do know that much of it does happen within the next century or so of Zephaniah's lifetime. The point is, God is going to deal with it, and God's going to deal with it in His time. If you're an ancient Israelite living in the nation of Judah in the 7th century BCE, particularly someone in the ruling class who really lives with the daily anxiousness of the invasion of foreign nations, a passage like this reassures you that God's got it. God's going to deal with it. God's going to take care of it. And again, it's all expressed in understandings of God from the ancient world. Understandings about God being a God of vengeance, and God being a God of judgment, and God being a God who destroys His enemies. Jesus is going to bring a corrective, a huge corrective to that understanding. But these points, they still apply. Could it be that this ancient message is really true in the present day? That all those things that worry, that concern you, that fester under the surface, God will deal with those things. God will deal with those things that concern you. And could it be that God will even use those things? Could it be that those things that most concern you and produce so much anxiety in you in the present moment, could those things in God's divine providence be even being used by God for our good in this present moment? And could we rest secure that God will act and work in His time? Jesus taught all three of these things. Jesus, Sermon on the Mount, why do you worry about your life? Why do you worry about your life? Because you've got a God who from the beginning of time has been working on behalf of His people to save them from the perils that would destroy them. And even take those things and use them for good in our lives. This is what Paul was talking about in Romans 8. Who can separate us from the love of God? Nothing. And if we can't be separated from the flow of God's love in our life, then all things work together for the good. And God will act in His time, which is another way of saying God is always acting. Jesus talked about the Spirit of God. The wind blows where it blows, and you don't know where it comes from or where it goes. You only see the sound. This is how the Spirit is presently at work, surrounding us, working God's plan on our behalf. God will work in His time, which is a way of saying God is always working in His time. Zephaniah's message to ancient Israel was, stop worrying. God's got this. Zephaniah's message to us would be the same. Stop worrying. God's got this. You live in a divine flow of God's goodness and love. And in that divine flow, God is working it all somehow in your favor and on your behalf. Could this be true? Yes, it's true, because this is the gospel. Zephaniah had a message of hope to the people in the 7th century of Judah. Interestingly, that message of hope, when translated through the ancient details, remains a powerful message of hope for us today.